There's a deep tragedy embedded in human relationships, and it often goes unnoticed until it's too late. It's the tragedy of misalignment of emotional roles that distort one another. And nowhere is this more evident than in the dynamic between the anxiously attached and the avoidantly inclined. Avoidantly attached individuals have a complex and paradoxical relationship with intimacy. On the surface, they may seem calm, detached, and even indifferent in the face of emotional closeness. But what often goes unseen is the inner turmoil that surfaces when that closeness disappears. It's not in your presence that they begin to truly reflect. It's in your absence, when the emotional input quiets down, that the avoidant mind starts to process what it has lost, or more accurately, what it pushed away. When you're emotionally available, consistently present, and giving, the avoidant nervous system becomes overwhelmed, not by malice or cruelty, but by conditioning. Emotional closeness triggers a deep-seated fear of engulfment, of losing their autonomy or becoming vulnerable. So instead of engaging, they retreat, they build walls, they create distance, and they convince themselves that this distance is clarity, that the discomfort they feel is caused by you, not by their own unprocessed emotional wiring. In this dynamic, closeness becomes noise. It's too much, too fast, too demanding of a part of them they've long suppressed. So rather than reflect on the relationship while it's active, avoidants typically go into a kind of emotional shutdown. They rationalize their feelings, suppress their needs, and intellectualize their behavior. They say things like, I just need space, or it's not you, it's me, but they rarely dive into what that space is actually for. They don't use it for healing, not initially, they use it for escape. But when you stop texting, when you stop showing up emotionally, when you no longer feed the dynamic, they don't get what they expected. They anticipated relief, they imagined peace, instead they get silence. And in that silence, something begins to shift. The nervous system that was once triggered by connection is now triggered by the absence of it. Memory takes the place of interaction. Reflection begins to replace avoidance. Because now, without the noise of closeness, the avoidant has to confront the echo of your presence. The way you made them feel safe, seen, or supported starts to resurface, not as suffocation, but as comfort. And that's the great irony of the avoidant psychology. What they couldn't appreciate in presence, they begin to value in absence. This is not an immediate awakening. It often comes in waves. First denial, then discomfort, and eventually introspection. Avoidants don't reflect well in the warmth of closeness, because that warmth activates their flight response. But in the cold distance of your absence, they finally begin to feel what they've been running from. They begin to remember not what they feared, but what they miss. And it is in that quiet void that they are most likely to realize your worth. Not because you forced them to see it, but because you gave them the space to. Overgiving, while often rooted in love and good intention, can have the paradoxical effect of diminishing the value you hold in the eyes of an avoidantly attached individual. This is not because kindness or generosity are inherently unattractive, but because when they are given in excess, especially to someone who fears emotional dependence, they begin to signal imbalance. The avoidance often unconsciously equates relentless giving with a lack of self-boundaries, and over time this dynamic undermines the mutual respect necessary for deep emotional connection. In psychological terms, value is often derived from scarcity and mutual investment. When one person gives disproportionately, constantly reaching out, accommodating, sacrificing, or chasing, it disrupts the equilibrium. The avoidant, already inclined to protect their autonomy and avoid enmeshment, starts to interpret the overgiver's behavior not as love, but as pressure. And when that pressure becomes chronic, it turns into emotional noise, something they feel compelled to withdraw from. The very act that is meant to bond becomes the trigger for distance. Moreover, overgiving often reflects a subconscious strategy to earn love rather than to share it. It stems from a fear of abandonment or rejection, driving the giver to prove their worth through service, reassurance, and emotional labor. To the avoidant, this doesn't feel like strength, it feels like dependency. And the more they sense that your sense of identity and well-being are contingent on their response, the less secure they feel. Ironically, it is this need to secure love through overgiving that makes the giver appear less secure in themselves. This isn't about playing games or withholding love to manipulate value. It's about understanding that healthy relationships are built on reciprocity, not compensation. When someone is consistently over availability, always initiating, always giving without requiring anything in return, the dynamic loses polarity. The avoidant partner doesn't have space to contribute or lean in because the overgiver has already filled every gap. This creates emotional suffocation masked as kindness. Furthermore, avoidants are hypersensitive to expectations. When overgiving comes with the unspoken expectation of reciprocation or validation, it breeds resentment, often unspoken but deeply felt. The avoidant begins to associate the relationship with guilt or obligation, which further drives their instinct to detach. They don't consciously recognize the imbalance. They just feel overwhelmed, trapped, or disinterested. And they pull away not necessarily because they don't care, but because the dynamic doesn't feel emotionally safe to them. To reverse this, one must step back, not out of punishment, but out of self-respect. Reclaiming your value means valuing yourself enough not to give endlessly in hopes of being chosen. It means understanding that space allows appreciation to grow. When the overgiving stops, the avoidant is no longer buffered by constant reassurance, and they are left with the absence that reveals what was taken for granted. In that space, perceived value begins to rise again, not because you demanded it, but because you restored the balance. Self-respect is one of the most powerful forces in any relational dynamic, but it is especially disruptive and transformative when dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment style. The avoidant control loop is a psychological pattern where distance equals safety. In this cycle, the avoidant partner pulls back emotionally, creating space not only to protect themselves from intimacy, but also to regain a sense of autonomy and control over their environment. They often operate under the unconscious assumption that others will close the gap they've created through chasing, over-explaining, over-giving, or emotional pleading. This pursuit reinforces their power and allows them to maintain emotional distance while still being desired. But when self-respect enters the equation, that entire loop begins to fracture. Self-respect is the refusal to beg for affection, to contort yourself to be seen, or to trade authenticity for approval. When you stop chasing, stop explaining, and stop over-accommodating, when you hold your emotional boundaries with quiet dignity, the avoidant loses their usual source of confirmation that you'll always be there, regardless of how distant or inconsistent they become. That lack of pursuit is deeply unsettling for the avoidant psyche, not because they've stopped caring, but because it breaks a pattern they've unconsciously relied on for control. Most avoidants do not understand the depth of the emotional games they're playing, not consciously. Their distancing is often automatic, driven by early developmental conditioning that equates closeness with emotional threat. But when you meet their withdrawal with self-respect rather than panic, something rare happens. They are forced to confront the space they've created without the buffer of your overinvestment. This silence, this boundary, reveals the consequences of their behavior. It shows them, in a way words never could, that love is not guaranteed when it's neglected. Avoidants typically assume you'll wait, that you'll reach out eventually, that your empathy will override your boundaries. When it doesn't, they're pushed into an internal conflict. On one hand, they're relieved by the distance, temporarily, but on the other, they begin to feel the subtle anxiety of loss, the absence of the person who once made emotional safety easy. Your self-respect forces them to consider what they had and why it's no longer freely accessible. This doesn't always result in immediate change, but it does interrupt the default loop of distance equals power, Importantly, self-respect isn't about punishing or manipulating. It's about refusing to participate in a dynamic that depletes your sense of self. It's about valuing your peace over their confusion. And in doing so, you reframe the emotional landscape. Instead of being the one who fears loss, you become the one who accepts it rather than lose yourself. In this interruption, the avoidant is given the rare opportunity to confront themselves, not through argument, not through pressure, but through the mirror of your self-worth. And in that mirror, they may finally see what their control has cost them. Emotional consistency is a rare and powerful force in a relationship with an avoidantly attached person, precisely because it highlights the contrast between your grounded presence and their erratic emotional detachment. Avoidants, by nature, are drawn to control, unpredictability, and distance as protective mechanisms. Their internal world is often chaotic, filled with repressed emotions, fear of engulfment, and a constant tug-of-war between the desire for intimacy and the fear of losing autonomy. When they interact with someone who is emotionally consistent, someone who is clear, calm, and self-regulated, it creates a psychological contrast that becomes impossible to ignore. This contrast doesn't work by force or persuasion. It works because emotional consistency exposes the avoidant's internal dissonance. When someone is emotionally reactive or overly accommodating, the avoidant feels justified in withdrawing. The emotional chaos feels familiar, and it reinforces their belief that closeness leads to discomfort. But when the person they're dealing with doesn't chase, doesn't spiral, and doesn't seek constant reassurance, the avoidant is forced to sit with their own discomfort. Without distraction or justification, it's in that silence and steadiness that something begins to stir in the avoidant psyche, a subtle awareness that their defense mechanisms are no longer necessary in the same way. Emotional consistency doesn't provoke, it invites. It doesn't demand closeness, it makes space for it. That stability becomes an unexpected mirror to the avoidant's inner turbulence, and because avoidants are not emotionally numb, they're emotionally guarded, this mirror begins to challenge their habitual pattern. They may not show it outwardly at first, but they notice deeply. Avoidants are often suspicious of emotional extremes. If you're too intense, they pull away. If you're too passive, they lose interest. But consistency occupies a space they don't know how to categorize. It's not manipulative, yet it's powerful. It's not clingy, yet it communicates depth. That middle ground becomes emotionally magnetic, not because it overwhelms them, but because it feels safe in a way they're not used to. It introduces a new template for intimacy, one where emotions are stable, communication is clear, and love doesn't have to come with chaos. Over time, this contrast becomes internalized. The avoidant begins to recognize that your emotional consistency isn't about perfection, it's about maturity. And in recognizing that, they start to question their own emotional habits. They reflect on why they keep pulling away and what they're actually trying to protect. They realize, perhaps for the first time, that it's not closeness that's unsafe, it's their own unresolved fear of being seen. What emotional consistency ultimately does is offer the avoidant a new experience of connection, one without strings, power plays, or emotional volatility. And in doing so, it begins to dismantle the emotional walls they've spent years building. Slowly, your steady presence creates a contrast so profound they can no longer ignore the emptiness in their own patterns, and in that stillness, the real work of emotional healing can begin. Avoidantly attached individuals are often drawn compulsively, and sometimes unconsciously, to unresolved emotional imprints. These are the emotional residues left behind by relationships that were intense, unfinished, or left open-ended. And while the avoidance instinct is to flee closeness, they are paradoxically magnetized to the very emotions they try to suppress or escape. This is not because they consciously seek drama or pain, but because their inner world is wired to return to what is unresolved in an effort to find closure without the vulnerability required to actually achieve it. Emotional imprints are not just memories, they are felt experiences that live in the body and mind long after the relationship ends. For the avoidant, who habitually suppresses their emotional needs, these imprints often become stronger with time, not weaker. When they pull away from someone who has made a deep emotional impact, they may initially feel relief, freedom from the pressure of intimacy, but that relief is surface level. Beneath it, the emotional residue remains, quietly influencing their thoughts, feelings, and even their future behavior. One of the reasons avoidants are so drawn to unresolved emotional experiences is because they rarely allow themselves to fully engage with their feelings in real time. They disconnect during conflict, they shut down when emotions rise, and they often leave relationships prematurely, not because the connection wasn't meaningful, but because it was. The intensity of that connection threatened their emotional defenses, so they retreat. But what they don't realize is that by leaving without resolution, they preserve the emotional charge. It becomes frozen in time. This is why so many avoidants find themselves obsessing over past partners, especially the ones they didn't allow themselves to fully open up to. These individuals represent not only the unresolved emotions of love or connection, but also the unfinished journey of their own emotional development. The ex who held them in their vulnerability, who challenged their defenses with calmness and clarity, becomes the symbolic figure of both comfort and confrontation. And this paradox is what pulls them back. Avoidants are also wired for patterns. Their subconscious constantly loops through past relationships, seeking to resolve unfinished narratives. The more an emotional imprint resists closure, the more the partner withdraws, enforces boundaries, or grows stronger, the more the avoidance internal system flares with curiosity, longing, and regret. The imprint grows, not because of current interaction, but because of the emotional power left in what was unsaid, unfelt, and unresolved. What's most ironic is that avoidants often try to replace these imprints with new distractions, new partners, pursuits, or goals. But the unresolved energy always returns. It is only when they face those imprints, when they begin to process what they pushed away, that they can find any real release. In the end, avoidants are not drawn to people at random. They are drawn to echoes of their own emotional past, the places where their defenses were gently tested, where they felt something they couldn't control, and where they now return over and over again in search of meaning, even if they can't admit it. In relationships marked by anxious avoidant dynamics, one of the most profound psychological truths is that your worth becomes most evident, not when you constantly try to prove it, but when you stop trying altogether. This shift from proving to simply being fundamentally alters the power dynamic between you and the avoidant partner. It signals not just a change in behavior, but a deep reorientation of self-respect, identity, and emotional boundaries. When you're in a relationship with someone who has an avoidant attachment style, the temptation to over-explain, over-give, or overcompensate becomes almost reflexive. You feel the emotional distance, and your instinct is to bridge the gap, to show them how safe you are, how loving you can be, how patient you're willing to become. But the more you do this, the less they respect it. Not because love and effort aren't valuable, but because to the avoidant mind, anything freely given is often unconsciously devalued. If you're always available, always initiating, always soothing their fears, they never have to confront their own emotional limitations. You become part of their coping strategy, something they take for granted while claiming they need space. But the moment you stop proving your worth, when you stop chasing, justifying, or waiting, you interrupt the avoidance emotional script. You are no longer the predictable constant in their world. You remove the psychological safety net they never acknowledged but always relied on. And suddenly, the absence of your effort becomes louder than all your presence ever was. This isn't about manipulation. It's about reclaiming dignity, because true self-worth doesn't beg to be seen. It doesn't plead or convince. It exists as a quiet, unshakable posture, one that says, I know who I am, and I don't need to be chosen to be valuable. When you step back from the role of emotional caretaker and begin honoring your own emotional needs, something remarkable happens. The avoidant begins to feel the vacuum of your absence, and that vacuum is unsettling. It forces them to confront a question they've long avoided. Why did I need this person so close if I claimed I wanted them far away? In that space, reflection begins, memory takes over, the avoidant mind, so accustomed to fleeing closeness, begins to ruminate on what's no longer accessible, and often, for the first time, they begin to see your worth not as something you performed or packaged, but as something intrinsic they failed to honor. It's in your stillness, your boundaries, your refusal to self-abandon for the sake of being chosen, that your value becomes undeniable. Because worth isn't measured by how much effort you exert, it's revealed when you trust that you don't need to. That is the paradox of love and power in relationships. The more you cling, the more you dissolve. But the more you stand in your truth, the more your presence lingers, even in your absence.